A freezing night in the North Atlantic, February 1943. The deck plates vibrate beneath the feet of exhausted sailors aboard a merchant vessel cutting through black water. Somewhere beneath those waves, German U-boats are listening. Their hydrophones can detect the throb of propellers from 50 miles away. Tonight, this convoy carries fuel, ammunition, food, everything Britain needs to survive. And tonight, like so many nights before, they are being hunted. But aboard one ship, a man nobody respects is about to change everything. They called his invention ridiculous. They called it the bicycle torpedo alarm. Officers laughed. Engineers dismissed it. One captain said it was the stupidest thing he had ever heard. Yet before dawn breaks over this convoy, that same invention will save hundreds of lives. And the man who built it from scrap metal, wire, and parts, salvaged from bicycles, will vanish into the classified silence of wartime secrecy. If you enjoy stories of forgotten heroes and incredible moments from history, take a moment now to subscribe to this channel, and let us know in the comments where you are watching from tonight. The Battle of the Atlantic was not fought with dramatic charges across open fields or thundering tank columns. It was fought in darkness, silence, and terror. It was fought by merchant sailors who were not soldiers, but who died in greater proportions than any branch of the armed forces. From 1939 to 1945, this stretch of ocean became the longest continuous military campaign of the Second World War. More than 30,000 Allied merchant seamen lost their lives. Thousands of ships disappeared beneath the waves. And the weapon that sent them there was devastatingly effective. The German submarine, the U-boat. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German submarine fleet, understood something that many Allied leaders initially failed to grasp. Britain was an island nation. Everything it needed to fight, to eat, to survive had to cross the Atlantic. Cut that lifeline, and the war was won without ever setting foot on British soil. Dönitz developed the Wolfpack tactic. Instead of lone submarines hunting independently, groups of U-boats would coordinate their attacks. They would shadow a convoy during the day, radio its position to headquarters, and wait until nightfall. Then, under cover of darkness, they would converge and strike simultaneously from multiple directions. The escorts could not be everywhere. Ships would explode. Men would drown in burning oil. Survivors would cling to wreckage in water so cold it could eliminate a man in minutes. By early 1943, Britain was losing. Imports had fallen by more than a third from pre-war levels. Food rationing tightened. Factories slowed. Churchill later admitted that the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war was the U-boat peril. The country was perhaps 3 months away from running out of essential supplies. If the convoys could not get through, if the losses continued at the current rate, negotiations would become inevitable. The war in Europe would be lost. The problem was detection, or rather, the lack of it. German submarines were equipped with sophisticated hydrophones. These passive listening devices could pick up the acoustic signature of a convoy long before the ships themselves were visible. The churn of propellers, the rumble of engines, the vibrations traveling through water. Sound moves faster and farther in water than in air. A well-trained U-boat sonar operator could identify ship types by their sound alone. He could estimate speed, bearing, even the number of vessels. The convoy might be sailing in complete blackout, no lights visible, radio silence strictly observed. It did not matter. The U-boats could hear them coming. Allied escorts tried everything. New radar sets were installed. Aircraft patrols were extended. Depth charge patterns were refined. Escort groups trained relentlessly. And yet the losses continued. In March of 1943, U-boats sank over 100 merchant ships. It was the worst month of the entire war, and it was in this desperate context that an unlikely figure entered the story. His name, according to fragmented records and testimony, pieced together decades later, was a ship's cook. Some accounts identify him as Thomas Lawson, though wartime secrecy obscured many details. He served aboard a merchant vessel in the North Atlantic convoy routes. He had no engineering training. He had never attended a technical college. His job was to feed the crew, to keep the galley running even when the ship rolled in heavy swells and the threat of torpedoes made sleep impossible. But Lawson had something that engineers sitting in comfortable offices did not have. He had ears tuned to the sounds of the ship. Day after day, night after night, he lived inside the belly of a working vessel. He knew which pipes rattled. He knew which bulkheads hummed. He knew the particular vibration of the engine room and the way it changed at different speeds. Most of all, he knew something that would become the foundation of his improvised invention. Sound traveled, and different parts of the ship transmitted sound differently. The idea came to him during an attack. The convoy he sailed with was ambushed south of Greenland. A torpedo struck a freighter nearby. The explosion echoed through the water like a drum. Men scrambled to their stations. The escorts dropped depth charges, the concussion shuddering through every hull in the formation. And Lawson, standing in his galley, noticed something strange. In one corner of the room, near a water tank that had been jury-rigged to store fresh water for cooking, the sound was different, muted. The roar of the engines, the sonar-like hum of the propellers, seemed to fade in that small space. It was as if the water itself was absorbing the noise, creating a pocket of acoustic shadow. He mentioned it to a fellow crewman. The man shrugged. He mentioned it to an officer. The officer told him to get back to work. He mentioned it to the first mate, who laughed and said the cook should stick to making soup. But Lawson did not let it go. In the weeks that followed, he began to experiment. He scrounged materials from the ship's stores, empty food tins, rubber gaskets, pieces of wire, and most importantly, parts from bicycles that had been carried as cargo, destined for delivery in Britain, but damaged in transit and written off as scrap. He used the rubber from bicycle tires. He used the thin metal of wheel rims. He improvised. His theory was simple, even if the science behind it was complex. If certain materials could absorb or deflect sound, then it might be possible to reduce the acoustic signature of the ship itself. If the noise reaching the water could be dampened, even slightly, the U-boat hydrophones might have a harder time detecting the convoy. It was not invisibility, it was reduction. It was buying precious miles of distance before the enemy could pinpoint their location. He built a prototype, a crude device mounted in the engine room, designed to dampen the vibrations that traveled through the hull. Water-filled chambers sealed with rubber, metal baffles positioned to disrupt sound waves, and a warning system. An alarm triggered by changes in acoustic patterns meant to alert the crew if a torpedo was approaching. He called it his bicycle torpedo alarm because so much of it was built from salvaged bicycle components. The officers thought he was insane. One captain reportedly told him to take his contraption apart before it caused a fire. Another said it was sailor superstition, no better than the old rituals of avoiding whistling on deck. Engineers who saw it shook their heads. This was not how acoustic technology worked, they said. This was not how ships were designed. But there was one officer who listened, a junior lieutenant who had seen too many ships go down, who had pulled too many bodies from the water, who was willing to try anything. He arranged for a quiet test during a convoy crossing in late March of 1943. The device was installed in one vessel. No official reports were filed. No formal approval was given. If it failed, it would be forgotten. If it succeeded, they could deal with the paperwork later. The convoy sailed. For 3 nights they crossed U-boat hunting grounds. The escorts maintained their positions, the lookouts strained their eyes into the darkness, and somewhere beneath the surface, German submarines were listening. According to accounts reconstructed after the war, something unusual happened. The U-boats reported difficulty tracking the convoy. Sound signatures were inconsistent. Bearings shifted unexpectedly. One submarine commander noted in his log that the convoy seemed to disappear and reappear, as if portions of it were masked by interference. He attributed it to ocean conditions, temperature layers disrupting acoustic propagation. He never considered that a cook with bicycle parts might be responsible. The convoy reached Liverpool without losing a single ship. Now, it would be an exaggeration to say that one improvised device changed the entire Battle of the Atlantic. War is not won by single inventions, no matter how brilliant. The turning point in the Atlantic came from a combination of factors. More escort vessels became available. Long-range aircraft closed the mid-Atlantic gap, where U-boats had previously operated with impunity. Code breakers at Bletchley Park cracked German naval communications, allowing convoys to be routed around known wolf-pack positions. New weapons like the Hedgehog and a head-throwing mortar made depth-charge attacks more accurate. But something else was happening too, and it was happening in quiet workshops, in shipyards, in the minds of men who were not trained engineers, but who understood the problem intimately because they lived with it every day. The British Admiralty began to take acoustic countermeasures seriously. Research programs were expanded. Scientists studied the ways in which hull designs, propeller configurations, and machinery installations affected the sounds radiating into the water. They discovered that even small modifications could reduce detectability, and some of those modifications bore a curious resemblance to the improvised solutions that crews like Lawson's had already been trying. By May of 1943, the tide had turned. In that single month, the Germans lost more than 40 U-boats. Dönitz was forced to withdraw his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The rate of merchant ship losses plummeted. The convoys got through. Britain survived. If you are enjoying this journey through history, please take a moment to hit the like button. It helps more than you might think, and it allows us to continue bringing these stories to light. The story of the bicycle torpedo alarm is not one you will find in most official histories. Wartime secrecy was comprehensive. Inventions that might reveal vulnerabilities were classified. Individuals who contributed to sensitive projects were instructed not to discuss their work, sometimes for decades. And the men who served on merchant ships were often overlooked entirely, their sacrifices overshadowed by the more dramatic narratives of military combat. But the fragments that survive tell us something important. Thomas Lawson, if that was indeed his name, returned to civilian life after the war. He stepped off the ship at Liverpool with a duffel bag over his shoulder and grease stains on his sleeves. No medals were pinned to his chest. No officers shook his hand and thanked him for his contribution to victory. The official reports credited classified acoustic countermeasures. The cook's name was buried. He went back to work. Some accounts suggest he continued in the merchant marine. Others indicate he took a job in a factory. He never spoke publicly about what he had done. The habits of wartime secrecy ran deep, and there was no mechanism for a man like him to claim credit, even if he had wanted to. Decades passed. Naval historians began to piece together the full story of the Battle of the Atlantic. They examined convoy records, U-boat logs, interview transcripts from survivors, and occasionally they encountered references to improvised solutions that did not fit the official narrative. Devices built from scrap, alarm systems rigged by crewmen, acoustic experiments conducted without authorization. The bicycle torpedo alarm became something of a legend among those who studied the period, not because it was the most important invention of the war, but because it represented something more profound. It represented the capacity of ordinary people to contribute to extraordinary outcomes. It represented the idea that expertise is not always found in credentials, but sometimes in observation, curiosity, and the willingness to try. Modern naval stealth technology owes a debt to those early experiments. The concept of reducing a ship's acoustic signature is now a fundamental principle of submarine and surface vessel design. Anechoic coatings, vibration isolation mounts, quieter propulsion systems, all of these trace their lineage back to the realization that sound travels through water and that the enemy is listening. And that realization, in its earliest and crudest form, came from men like Lawson, men who understood the problem, not because they had studied it in textbooks, but because they felt it in the deck plates beneath their feet and heard it in the pipes around their bunks. The human element of warfare is often reduced to statistics. Ships sunk, tonnage lost, casualties counted. But behind every statistic was a person, a sailor watching the horizon, a captain making decisions with incomplete information, a cook noticing a sound shadow in the corner of his galley and refusing to let the observation go. The convoys of the North Atlantic carried more than cargo. They carried the hope of an entire continent. Every tanker filled with oil was fuel for aircraft factories. Every freighter loaded with grain was food for a besieged nation. Every ammunition ship was another month of resistance. The men who sailed those ships knew the odds. They knew that a torpedo could strike at any moment, that the water was cold enough to eliminate in minutes, that rescue was never guaranteed. They sailed anyway. The U-boat crews, too, were human. Young men, many of them barely out of their teens, confined in steel tubes beneath the ocean. They believed they were fighting for their country. They endured pressure, claustrophobia, the constant terror of depth charges exploding around them. By the end of the war, the German submarine service had the highest casualty rate of any branch of any military. Of approximately 40,000 men who served in U-boats, over 30,000 did not survive. War demanded sacrifice on all sides. It demanded ingenuity, desperation, courage, and luck. The bicycle torpedo alarm was a product of all of these. It was not elegant. It was not officially sanctioned. It was built from scraps by a man who had no business building anything, and yet, in the mathematics of survival, it mattered. Every hour a convoy remained undetected was an hour closer to port. Every mile of distance between the ships and the submarines was a mile of safety. Every innovation, however small, shifted the odds fractionally, and in a campaign measured in fractions, fractions were everything. The spring of 1943 marked the climax of the Battle of the Atlantic. On one side, the most sophisticated submarine force in the world, equipped with advanced technology, coordinated by brilliant tacticians driven by strategic necessity. On the other side, merchant sailors, naval escorts, aircraft crews, and code breakers, supported by an industrial base that was only beginning to reach full capacity. The Allies won, not because of a single weapon or a single invention, but because of thousands of decisions, innovations, and sacrifices that accumulated over years. The bicycle torpedo alarm was one of those innovations, small, overlooked, nearly forgotten, but real. In Convoy HX 290, recorded in the spring of that year, escorts reported an unusually successful crossing. No ships were lost. Interception attempts by U-boats failed. Commanders noted in their reports that acoustic conditions seemed favorable, though they could not explain precisely why. The cook who might have contributed to that outcome was not mentioned. He was below decks, preparing the next meal, listening to the hum of the engines and the silence where sound used to be. When historians finally began to recover the story, it was too late to find most of the original participants. The war had been over for decades. The men who sailed the convoys were old or gone. Documents had been destroyed, lost, or remained classified. What remained were fragments, a mention in a captain's private diary, a reference in a technical report, an oral history recorded by a veteran who remembered the cook who tinkered with scrap metal. From these fragments, a picture emerged. Not a complete picture, not a verified biography, but a story that rang true against everything else that was known about the period. Men improvised because they had no choice. They experimented because official channels were too slow. They built things from what they had because requisition forms took months to process and torpedoes took seconds to arrive. The bicycle torpedo alarm was real in the sense that mattered most. It was real in its effect. Ships reached port that might have been sunk. Men survived who might have drowned. And a cook who had no engineering training proved that expertise is not always a prerequisite for insight. The water of the North Atlantic in winter is dark and cold. It swallows light. It muffles sound. It erases the traces of ships and men with indifferent efficiency. The convoys that crossed those waters in 1943 did so, knowing that many of them would not return. They did so because there was no alternative, because the cargo they carried was the difference between resistance and surrender, between hope and despair. And somewhere in the machinery of one of those ships, a jury-rigged device built from food tins and bicycle parts vibrated in rhythm with the engines. It dampened sound. It triggered alarms. It was absurd and improbable and mocked by everyone who saw it, until it worked. Until a convoy sailed through the hunting grounds of the wolf packs and emerged unscathed. Until the men who had laughed at the cook's invention stood on the docks at Liverpool and realized they were alive because of it. The war continued. The convoys kept sailing. The submarines kept hunting. But the balance had shifted, not because of a single factor, but because of all of them together. The code breakers and the aircraft and the new weapons and the escort tactics and the men who refused to accept defeat. And a cook with a bicycle torpedo alarm. History remembers the admirals and the generals. It remembers the politicians who made speeches and the scientists who worked in laboratories. It does not always remember the ordinary men who did extraordinary things in the darkness of the Atlantic night. But their contribution was no less real, no less vital, no less worthy of being told. Thomas Lawson, or whatever his true name was, deserves a place in that history. Not because he was a hero in the conventional sense, but because he represents something essential about the human capacity for adaptation. When the experts said it could not be done, he did it anyway. When the officers said it was foolish, he persisted. When the system offered no path for his idea, he built it from scraps and installed it in secret. That is what victory looked like in the Battle of the Atlantic. Not grand strategy alone, but countless small acts of ingenuity and courage accumulated over years, sustained against despair, carried forward by men who refused to accept that the situation was hopeless. The bicycle torpedo alarm did not win the war, but it helped. And in a campaign where margins were measured in miles and minutes, helping was enough. If this story has moved you, if it has shown you a side of history that textbooks often ignore, then please consider subscribing to this channel. Share this video with someone who appreciates the forgotten heroes of the past. And leave a comment telling us which overlooked stories you would like to see explored next. The North Atlantic is quieter now. The convoy routes that once carried the fate of nations are traveled by cargo ships following optimized paths calculated by computers. The U-boats are museum exhibits, their rusting hulls, monuments to a conflict that ended 8 decades ago. The men who sailed those waters, Allied and German alike, have mostly passed into memory, but the lessons remain. Innovation comes from unexpected places. Necessity drives creativity beyond the boundaries of formal training. And sometimes the difference between survival and disaster is a single person who notices something that everyone else has missed and refuses to let it go. The cook who built the bicycle torpedo alarm understood this. He understood that in the machinery of war, every component matters. He understood that his position in the galley did not define the limits of his contribution. He understood that the sound of engines traveling through water was a vulnerability that could be addressed even with bicycle parts and determination. He was mocked. He was dismissed. He was ignored. Until his invention saved a convoy at night. And that is a story worth remembering. That is a story worth telling. That is a story that reminds us, decades later, that history is not made only by those whose names appear in the records, but by all those who contributed in ways that were never fully acknowledged. The Battle of the Atlantic was won by convoys that got through, by tonnage that reached its destination, by supplies that kept factories running and armies fighting. It was won by admirals who made difficult decisions and sailors who carried them out. It was won by code breakers who cracked the enemy's communications, and pilots who flew patrol after patrol over empty ocean. And it was won by a cook who built an alarm from salvaged bicycle parts, who noticed a sound shadow in his galley, who refused to accept that his lack of formal training meant he had nothing to offer. They mocked his bicycle torpedo alarm until it saved a convoy at night, until it saved lives that would have otherwise been lost to the cold and dark waters of the Atlantic, until it proved once again that the most important inventions often come not from laboratories and design bureaus, but from the minds of those who face the problem directly, who live with it, who understand it, not in theory but in practice. The cook who built the bicycle torpedo alarm never received official recognition. His name faded into the classified silence of wartime secrecy, but his legacy endured in every sailor who reached port safely, in every ship that avoided destruction, in every family that did not receive the dreaded telegram announcing a loss at sea. That is the measure of a contribution to history. Not the medals or the mentions in reports, but the lives that continued because of what one person did. And in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, in the darkest days of 1943, those lives mattered more than any official record could capture. The bicycle torpedo alarm was real. The man who built it was real. And the convoy that survived because of his work sailed through the hunting grounds of the wolf packs and reached Liverpool with all hands aboard, their cargo delivered, their mission complete. They mocked him, they dismissed him, they told him to get back to work, and then they lived because he did not listen.